Welcome back, everyone. We are calling in live from Kansas today, Kearney, Kansas. We are right across the border. I, in fact, no kidding, followed bales of hay to get in today, and I am surrounded in every direction by corn. So it's an interesting space, but right here in the middle there is a Starbucks. So go figure. It's kind of like McDonald's everywhere. We now have Starbucks everywhere. Today we are focused on our last interview for our segment on the military for this month, and we are excited to bring our guest on. We were just dealing with some connectivity issues, so we're a few minutes delayed. But today we're going to be kind of tying a bow around everything that we've been learning about all the different programs and the vets and the communities and the scientists, the contractors, the active duty personnel. We've really run the gamut this month. It's been, if you're following along, I hope it's been informative. I know for me, I have learned a tremendous amount. This is an area in which I work, so I'm not sure I expected to learn quite as much as I did, but I'm excited to get the National Service Strategy completed. I'd like to say today, but at least roughed out today. I've got it all in my mind, and I've got to get it to paper, which seems like a small task, but it's actually quite involved in getting all that design ready. But I'm excited. I like the transition to think of it as a service strategy, so that we can incorporate all Americans and support staff. Certainly, our active duty military is our number one focus, and our reservists right there beside them. But in order for everyone to be at readiness, in order to defend this country, we need to think about every person and how everything that we do, from our actions online to our actions within our country, that allow us to connect and to be that first line of defense. We have to think about our political space and make sure that we are acting in the diplomatic space well and balanced. So there'll be a little bit of all of that in the strategy, and I'm excited to get it to paper. I'm trying to debate if I'm going to still get the whiteboard out of it. Mostly just because I love whiteboards and Twizzlers. I mean, that is definitely a fun thing. So, but yeah, so we're just waiting for our guest, and we'll get started today. I suppose I can go a little bit into how the strategy is going to be organized. We're focusing first on service to the country, second to the communities that come together, and then third, making sure that we amplify and support our Defense Department. And with that, we will make our transition. Moving on. I'm so glad our connection is better now. Are we all good?
Yeah, it sounds good to me. How's it sound to you?
Wonderful. Mistake there, sorry. So I've been able to give the intro, which allows me to pass it directly to you and have you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Well, it's been quite a journey, and I started off towards the end of the Cold War, joining the Army in a much different military than, of course, the one we have now. And I was in a very small branch of the Army that I didn't feel a lot of love for. So shortly thereafter, I became a military intelligence officer, and stayed through that, through tours in Korea, a few tours in the States, and then I was on a tour in the Balkans. And in the mid-90s, when I discovered something called information operations, and it seemed like these guys were the ones that were the focus of everything, because at that time it was all about trying to get these previously, in some cases still warring parties together, and get them to agree on how they might form a society much like the one they had in the former Yugoslavia. And to understand their decision making, we relied on these guys that were from something called the Land Information Warfare Activity, which was a U.S. Army activity out of Fort Belvoir, Virginia, that helped the commander understand what decision making meant to these guys, and how we might understand them better by looking at the historical context and how they made decisions in light of that. So I said, well, that looks really interesting, actually. It looks like a lot more interesting than the stuff I'm doing. So, uh, and a few years later, I asked to transfer to to a new branch called Information Operations in the Army, and I was told that no, you can't do that. We need too many people in military intelligence, and but fortunately, I had a board of senior officers that disagreed with them and allowed me to transfer. And then I found myself in the Balkans again, and when 9/11 happened, I was in Kosovo, and that was actually a great place to be because it turned deathly quiet there. Because just like everybody in the States, they were all too busy watching their TV. Um, and of course, after that, I came back a little early, and then I went to Afghanistan for most of the rest of 2002, and finished off my career in the Joint Staff after some more time spent abroad, and retired. And a few months later, after saying that I wouldn't do it, I ended up coming back to the Pentagon, working for at various points, a deputy assistant secretary working for them, and then later on as a consultant to the person who was in charge of information operations for the department. And what that really meant was helping them shepherd budgets through Congress, but also going out and taking a look at information operations in the field and how the services were doing that. And in light of the fact that our information environment, the environment in which we operate today has changed so radically, people forget that when you think back to the time even before cell phones, that how different the way we consumed information, made decisions, and the timeline we made decisions on was so radically different than it is today. And that there were senior decision makers in the Department of Defense, people like Secretary Gates, who understood the importance of this, made several overtures to the Department of State, some successful, some not, about how we might better integrate DoD communications, especially with people that were being affected and could affect the outcome of military operations, and how we might join forces with them. And that really has been well, I'm not going to call it a failure, but you might think that 20 years later we would be a little bit better at doing that and coordinating within the government on how to do that. But despite some baby steps, it really remains what I would say is a work in progress. So that's where I'm at now, and I still act as a consultant from my home in the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York, and occasionally get called to come down and take a look at some new things. The Army's doing some exciting things, but it's still a work in progress.
I think that's generous. Having just come out of that space, and so my background, one of my tasks was to talk about how to redesign the executive branch, and my number one recommendation was what you just said. It is that this communication piece, it's not just important because we find a lot of people answering the same question, but it's important because of that coordination piece, that readiness piece. Military readiness is not disjoint from national readiness, and it encompasses well beyond just our active duty actions. So if we were to able to make it more along the lines of a system that you have in your mind, what would be some of the first 2 or 3 things that we would want to see? You mentioned state, so I would definitely agree with that. There's some other departments and agencies as well, and certainly my mind goes to an even wider swath, education. So what are some of the things that you guys have talked about or that you have in your mind would be a tremendous improvement on our work in progress?
Yeah.
What would help us progress?
Yeah, it's well, of course, the easy answer is always more resources and more time. more time, meaning more training time, more time in the schedule, more time with senior leaders. But there's a lot of senior leaders who have experienced this firsthand in the field. And if you talk to them, they're just as frustrated as the rest of this about how they can have a great conversation with their interagency partners when they're outside the United States, but if they come back to Washington, it becomes much, much more difficult. There are some examples of things that have been developed in the last 20 years. One of them is organization at state, the Global Engagement Center, that despite being nested at state, has an executive branch and perimeter to cross boundaries. Yet, budget-wise, we know that's very difficult to do. So, what I would look at is let's stop talking about forming more interagency organizations and ad hoc groups and start looking at truly reorganizing along the lines of something like the National Counterterrorism Center, which has its fair share of critics, but it has accomplished a great deal. And in coordinating U.S. government strategy with regard to countering terrorism, including a communications piece that's embedded with that. And those communicators then have to go through this convoluted interagency process to get the agencies to go along with what they want. But at least they're able to put together plans, and they have some really smart people that can then work with those agencies to help implement those plans within those agencies. So I would recommend going and looking at something like that. I've heard a lot of recommendations about rebuilding USIA. I tell you, it's conceptually it sounds good, but USIA didn't have a sterling track record, so I'm not sure it's a great model. For one thing, it was always beholden to those at the State Department, despite some analysts saying to the contrary. But so yeah, I would look at some organization that would have the power to direct, and if not direct, at least have the power to be able to call up secretaries and agency directors and say, this is important, the president said we ought to do this, and that this is a plan that we put together with your help, by the way, often the help of staff several levels down, but nevertheless, it would have the power to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think what you've described, and correct me if I've misunderstood, but this is really where my head has been going, is instead of looking at here's the department and therefore we make decisions downward, here's the goal, and then here are the players we need at the table to be able to accomplish that goal, which is a bit different. I mean, it seems very logical, but that's not the way we operate in government, right? We go by our budget lines and we go by our department, and then we ask ourselves, what can our department do to affect X, whatever's on that line, instead of having an approach that really looks at the problem, that's more of a problem-centered approach than a department-centered approach.
That's right. In fact, it reminds me of one of the most effective organizations that I ever saw was something, and of course, the name of it doesn't spring immediately to mind, but it was essentially an outgrowth of the creation of Africa Command. Africa Command, for those that aren't familiar, was designed from the ground up as a command with interagency linkages, since we were never going to have an enormous presence on the continent of Africa. DOD and the other departments for that matter, we needed to leverage the presence that we did have and to achieve shared goals and to affect the national security strategy. And I got to go to a meeting in Stuttgart several years ago when this organization was still effective, and they brought the PA/PD officers from the North Africa and West Africa embassies together. So these people are very much focused on the problems at hand. They not only develop plans, but they're also responsible for implementing them. And just as you described, and that was one of the most effective interagency government meetings, interagency meetings I've ever been at, because while the money we were talking about was tens of thousands, which in DoD is like,
Oh,
give me
it's
a real
nothing.
problem.
Yeah.
That's too small. I can't do anything with that.
No, it's true.
Uh, and but nevertheless, we would come with the ability to leverage resources we did have control over to help them out. And in some cases, we're talking about embassies that are so small in which the public affairs and the public diplomacy officer are the same person, and they have a staff of half a dozen, and half of those are foreign nationals that are local hires within the embassy. So that was an excellent model, but it doesn't scale up. It doesn't.
Well, that
You
is the
can't.
trouble, is the scaling part. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I'm unconvinced that it's not, that it's entirely not scalable.
Hmm.
But you are correct. You can't just do more. You have to
Right.
maneuver through it. What we kind of rested on was a hybrid, where there was a level of hierarchy and separation, but there was significantly more compilation, connection, and problem focus
Hmm.
for making those organizations. One of the questions that actually came up with was, and I don't think we would go there, but at least for whiteboarding purposes, right, and consideration was, should we assume that we have all the same departments and cabinets that we have today
Hmm.
as we go into a new administration? And maybe it's not, every 4 years would be really excessive, but certainly every 20 to 50 years,
Hmm.
having that as part of the deal of the practice to at least question,
Hmm.
does this make sense today? Does this serve its purpose? Is it connecting to the other programs in the way that makes sense? Are the problems that we started with the same problems we're dealing with now? And certainly one would hope we made progress over time.
Hmm.
Um, but, some things are just universal, continuous problems. But, like, I don't think we're ever going to get rid of the Defense Department. But,
Right.
right. But we may restructure and we may rethink. And when that is not an assumption, when there is
Hmm.
no thought to at least question,
Hmm.
then of course we end up in positions where we stick to things because we've always done them. We drink our own
Yeah.
Kool-Aid. And
Sure.
I think, anyone who served in the military knows that one well. Anyone who has
Hmm.
served in local, state, or federal government also knows that well.
Hmm.
And it's just, we need to challenge the system, but for the right reasons and with respect, versus
Hmm.
challenge the system just to be different.
Right. And you can the way we're organized is still rooted in an act that passed Congress in 1947. And taking another look at that, um, boy, we love to talk about that behind closed doors in the Pentagon and at every level. I've heard, uh, well, not the secretary. Well, maybe I have, but I've heard a lot of senior officials say that, well, if I could change, if I could go back and tinker with that, I would. Um, well, why don't we? I don't know why.
Exactly.
When in the right after 9/11, a position was created. Well, not created, but was empowered to do something called strategic communication, which was described as an ability to match our words with our actions, words and deeds, and act as a coordinating body. But he was a staff of one, and despite his title as a principal deputy national security advisor, um, when he would come to the Pentagon or go to the State Department, and they would say, "Well, I'll have to check with our secretary about that." And sure enough, the secretary could say no, and we're not doing that. And if I have to call the president, I will, because that's who I work for. I don't work for this guy in the National Security Council. He might say he's speaking for the president, but I've never heard the president say that. So, you see the problem. There's
Oh
no org
yeah.
chart. Um,
Well,
so
there's a
why
written
don't
org chart and there's an unwritten org chart.
That's right. That's right. So, yeah, why don't we take another look at the National Security Act of 1947 and its amendments that came a few years later? It's a good idea. I don't know why it's never been seriously proposed, just like it seems very hard to get off the ground in an interagency planning committee
Yeah.
that involves senior people. And when it has, it was undermined at every step by those that were not included in the decision making. Even when they had, the best of intentions, um, it's part of the way human decision making works too. So we're dealing with that as well. We're all flawed human beings with regard to our biases and our commitment to the way things are or the way that we think they ought to be. And so I'm not, but I'm not suggesting that we shy away from it. We should take a look at reorganizing.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, I do hide my cape in my back. No. So yes, recognizing we're all flawed humans. Agreed on that point. I also agree with your last point, which is simply because that's the case does not mean that we should give up before trying.
That's right.
And maybe we don't progress entirely. Maybe we progress in steps. And nonetheless, though, we have to have more of that holistic view in order to be able to do
Mm-hmm.
that. So,
Mm-hmm.
segueing that slightly to the content you
Mm-hmm.
were talking about from an information perspective versus an intelligence perspective, many
Mm-hmm.
people don't know the difference. Can you help detangle?
Okay, well, information and information operations, at least in the Defense Department, is uh, is really the study of decision making. It is determining how people receive and act on information, and it has three components: the physical realm, like the device I'm holding in my hand, that we're communicating over, all the infrastructure between you, me, and the rest of the internet is certainly part of it. There's also the information itself. The content out there is something we have to grapple with, and we have to understand how um, it uh, it affects decision making. Certainly, if I was, uh, one of the old parts of information operations is something called electronic warfare, and in the past that was just suppression of electrons. We're just
Yeah.
trying to prevent the receipt or trying to prevent the return of these subatomic particles back to an antenna, or confuse it in some ways so that it doesn't provide an accurate picture. So we're messing with the information. We might be doing it through the hardware. And then, so that's two components. The third component is the cognitive piece, and that's the human decision-making piece. So DoD Information Operations looks at those three pieces. Originally it was embedded in military intelligence and the intelligence apparatus up until really 2006-7. It was managed by the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, um, and with one big exception, and that was something called psychological operations. Much maligned, but boy, if people could take a hard look at it, they would find out that it's really well, I think the most common response I get when people are first introduced to the idea of psychological operations is, boy, I'm glad we're doing that. I always wondered if we did. Um, and it could be something, these are the guys who would go out and, I found them in Afghanistan when I arrived there that were setting up a portable radio station. And so that we could talk to people because there was no infrastructure. So they're the ones who do that. So we're looking at those three components, and then we're trying to gather up all the tools to figure out how to influence decision making. Could be of our enemies, could be of the people who have a vested outcome and are vested interest in the outcome of military operations, or can influence it. So it could just be the people that are have no desire to be part of the military conflict, but are being affected by it. So how do we transmit information to them in a way that will, one, help them protect themselves, and two, at least not hinder the ability of us to achieve military objectives. And so it could be as simple as a piece of paper with writing on it in the appropriate language, I hope. It could be a radio station. it could be jamming a signal. We don't want two bad guys to be talking to each other when we're, trying to conduct operations. Um, but it also could be something a little more complex, like, hey, we know that missile system can shoot at us, but it needs a certain signal in order to do that. And how can we suppress that from getting there? We might use something that's, of course, come to being in recent times in cyber operations in doing that. If we want to inhibit people from communicating nowadays, we're often talking about taking down their ability to communicate over internet protocol system of some kind. So we try to merge all of that, but it doesn't oversee any of that. Information operations is not an owner of capabilities. Instead, it's a field that attempts to make sense of all of these components of decision making and then help commanders and leaders in the Defense Department decide how best to counteract that, because we live in a world awash in information. And I used to say that it was increasing, the speed of information was increasing, its volume was increasing, and the ubiquity of mobile telecommunications was increasing. And these three things together meant that you could travel virtually nowhere on Earth and not find yourself able to hook into the global information environment. And that's why it's got to be an important part of all military operations now.
I have to say it's going to become an important part of all American operations as well.
Sure.
I mean, because, the same thing is happening, whether it's adversarial nations leaping over military and going to civilians with some of that
Mm-hmm.
kind of those efforts. But also, I often say that weapons can be used to defend or destroy, and it only depends on who it is that's holding them, right? And so this
That's
kind
right.
of operation can be used, like you said, to keep bad guys from being able to connect to one another,
Mm-hmm.
to stop them from doing something terrible, to be able to understand the culture in order to be able to help better. Obviously, it can also be used against us in the same way. And so, but there's an extra piece. There is the unintentional piece as well, right? And now we get into just information being shared inaccurately throughout the country by somebody who maybe just doesn't realize that what they're sharing is inaccurate. But
Mm-hmm.
the impact of people hearing it repeatedly starts to make them think it is accurate, or they
Right.
think it's a bigger deal than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, statistics get blown out of proportion based on a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so uh, a an area that has not been popular, or we haven't had to focus on too much until the last few years, is the ability to defend ourselves against this,
Yeah,
and defend the American population against this. We did think about it in terms of cyber operations and the infrastructure,
right.
but we haven't thought seriously about the impact of information flows on decision making by the American public. And there are still people who don't take it seriously, of course. We read about that. So that's why it was so important that the agencies, you know, do a detailed analysis of the impact that foreign influence was having on our electoral system, on day-to-day decision making, on issues high and low, from the local level on up, and how we might protect ourselves against that, or call it out when we see it. And calling it out in a way that suggests that we're not just acting as a naysayer of the information being provided, but calling it out as, hey, there's no transparency here. Who are you? Why are you trying to influence this process? Need to come out of the shadows. And there's some interesting possibilities there. I was at a conference in Silicon Valley not too many years ago, at which one of the uh, uh, venture capital firms was talking about the possibility of building something to replace the IP networks, which of course would be an enormous undertaking with
Yeah,
this enormous infrastructure. But that would, each device would have when you are using it, if I'm using this phone, I'm listed as the owner, and similar to the way that blockchain works, that every piece of information that came from this phone would be marked as having come from me. So there would be instant and uh, verifiable transparency. Of course, there's also some downsides to that. It might be handy sometime if I don't want to be identified, but it there's some examples, whistleblowers and such, who might have a need for anonymity, but it certainly addresses this issue of anybody anywhere can put information out there, and if they can make it, if they can gather enough people to that belief or to like that statement, then it can take on a life of its own.
Wow, we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Certainly.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. I think you just tied a bow around all of it, bringing it home to each and every citizen. And that's really what we have to be able to do. And I think I'll just add one piece, which is kind of capping what you said, which is that we need to make sure that our military, our government, our commander-in-chief, and all of the agencies are working together to be able to do that. Decision making for military, but sharing that information with our civilian population as well. I know in Finland, for example, they focus on making sure that all their residents are armed with information, capabilities, and at least some idea of how to handle themselves in the event of different situations. I would love to see some of that for us, not to the point where you don't want to scare people or make people alarmed, but we do need to make sure that people are aware and they're aware of what to do under those circumstances. I gave the analogy earlier that the Defense Department is like the goalie on a team. There are many, many, many players before that ball gets to the goalie. And we need to make sure that every one of those pieces knows what to do and how to coordinate. So we're using our goalie as little as possible.
Indeed. It's a great analogy. That's a great analogy, and agree with it. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Good, me too. I will see you later. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.